Welcome back, everybody. You are watching the Decentralized Tech Livestream. This is where we talk about DePIN, DeFi, DAI, I guess, add anything to the end, internet capital markets, all the new innovation that's happening around blockchain to decentralized technologies. My name is Jon Radoff. I am joined here by Oscar, my intrepid producer, who makes it so much easier for me because I can just sit here and talk while Oscar throws videos on the screen, fields questions, all of that stuff. I'm from a company called Beamable. We're a DePIN project. We're building infrastructure backends for game developers. Get into that a little bit more in a bit because some of you are already asking about like the TGE, the presale, all that stuff. I'll mention it. Don't worry. We'll tell you where to go. But I wanted to let you know that we have a really, really cool guest today. I've got Neil here from Dawn. And Neil and I first met in Korea, really just, I guess it feels very recent, but maybe it was a couple months ago. I don't know. Time is all a blur at this point. And I really, really appreciated everything Neil had to say about DePIN at a particular talk we were. It was very pragmatic. It was quantitative. It was really cool. And I hope to bring that forward in today's conversation. But I'm going to let Neil just introduce himself first. So Neil, who are you? How did you get to this point in time?
Well, first, let me say, Jon, thanks so much for bringing me on here today, dude. I really appreciate it. And obviously, when we first connected in Korea, I think you're right. It's time kind of blurs together. It was like a month and a week ago. So again, man, I appreciate you having me on here. And for everyone who's never met me before, my name's Neil. I'm the co-founder and CEO of DePIN Internet. And so who I am, my background is as an electrical engineer from Princeton. That's where I live. I dropped out right before my senior year to my parents' pleasure. That was their favorite thing in the world. And I actually got pulled into the startup ecosystem. So I was first, VP of engineering at a healthcare analytics startup. Got kind of bored of building expensive SaaS stuff and ended up falling in love with connectivity. I guess there's like a long story behind all of that. We don't have to get too crazy into that. But suffice to say, the easiest answer is I just fell in love with this idea of how can people team up together to solve big connectivity issues. And that was kind of the beginning, I guess, of my career in telecom, so to say. It was really kind of just one thing led to another. Like my background as an electrical engineer wasn't in communication systems. It was in protocol design, a different kind of protocol, not crypto protocol design. So it was fun to kind of spread that gap and go from like this academic mindset to now building protocols that hopefully touch as many people as possible. I think what we're building at Dawn has an opportunity to really change the internet for forever, really. But that's a little bit of my background, Jon, and how we got here today. So yeah, let's go ahead and get right into it.
Really interesting because as I've met so many DePIN founders at this point, it's an interesting category within the broader crypto ecosystem, because the pattern that I'm now seeing is people that have deep domain expertise in a particular area, and then crypto becomes a way to orchestrate or organize things or gain access to capital or obviously decentralize the technology in a way that solves new versions of the problem. So that's interesting. I didn't even know that part of your background around electrical engineering, but now it all adds up and makes sense around some of the quantitative mindset I've heard from you. For those who are joining just now, by the way, we already have 100 people coming in. Love to have you here. There's a reason we do it live. We love when you ask your questions and you're actually here. So number one, makes my job way, way easier. I can just kind of sit back and field questions right off the screen. And I appreciate it, all of you people who make my life a little bit easier. Because my life's hard enough right now. I don't have enough hours in the day because we're doing a TGE in a couple of weeks. You can see it on my X profile. Everything's there. I don't need to talk about a lot of it, but it's taking essentially all my time. I think there might be a thing called negative time. Like there's some sort of singularity just absorbing all my time. But so Neil, let's dive into the project itself, and I think we'll probably see some questions rolling in from the audience here. Neil, talk about Dawn. Let's get into like specifics. Like what is the DePIN? What does it solve? And we'll go from there.
Do it. So Dawn is a protocol for providing decentralized broadband. The way to think about it is that rather than using wires to interconnect people, like the big cable incumbents do, like Verizon, Comcast, all of these guys, our kind of major idea was wireless is getting good enough to really compete against wires. So what we really need is a protocol that allows this entire orchestration to really happen. So to kind of your point about the orchestration layer here. And so the end objective really is to use wireless technology to disintermediate the guys that are using wires to provide internet for everybody. And the benefit of that entire model is that internet can just be much cheaper, much faster, much more resilient. And more importantly, I'd say is that it can actually be owned by the people rather than being owned by bigger corporations. And so the core crux of this argument really comes down to once you understand the unit economics of the internet. And it's not really all that complicated. It's the easiest example I always give is, right now I'm calling you from an internet connection that I'm paying $128 per month for a gigabit, right? And that $128, even though I'm paying for a gigabit, I don't end up using the whole gigabit, right? On an upload capacity, download capacity to do the stream as well. I'm using like what, 0.5% of my total supply. I have so much latent connectivity, especially if I'm getting a gigabit. It's really just a question if I had the ability to give that to my neighbors or to other people in my community, I could actually monetize my surplus. And so that kind of lends people to think kind of like an Airbnb type model for broadband is really one way to describe it. But on the flip side, aside from actually being able to do that, I'm also, if I'm able to use wireless technology to skip over the internet providers and go directly to the data centers, that's really where I can get gigabit internet for $5, $10 instead of $128 per month. So I think this entire idea of wireless just allows us to build a cheaper internet and allows consumers to form networks together and then go directly to data centers to get cheaper internet. That's really what we're building. And so I'd say the kind of high level thesis that I always give or like vision for this is, if we do our jobs right at dawn, I think we'll have done to internet what solar panels have done to electricity. So the same way that users can own their own infrastructure, they get access to a very cheap resource and then can even sell that surplus back to the grid. That's exactly the same idea of what we're trying to do. And I think that it's this entire arc of like sovereign ownership of over the last mile of the infrastructure, being able to seamlessly participate in the entire network. And yeah, that's our kind of entire trend that we're building here. So hopefully that's a good starting point for us today, John.
So I'm curious the overall surrounding economics of that. When I think about all of these broadband service providers that would then kind of still be the backbone of this network, but we're providing localized access through this. How much of their existing business model is premised on the fact that you're using that 0.5% of your bandwidth? And what changes for them if everyone starts saturating with DePIN nodes?
Almost all of their business model is dependent on that, actually. So if you look at like that's all typical people, in the industry, they're called oversubscription ratios. It's kind of the same thing for flights, right? Like they book more people than they know are going to show up. It's the same idea. So typically in like either it's GPON connections or XGS-PON connections, which are kind of how a single piece of fiber is shared across many different households. They're kind of all sharing that individual backhaul connection, right? And so the end idea is that in this type of configuration of what we're describing, nothing actually really changes because it's rather than the demand being kind of distributed out from the provider network, it's going towards the last mile and distributed outwards. So the end demand ends up staying constant. It just kind of flips the entire business model on the side where you don't actually need to have expensive infrastructure to be able to provide these sorts of networks. And so the big thing that you've kind of correctly identified is like oversubscription is a huge reason for all of this. The second piece towards this is if you look at kind of like the paybacks of existing infrastructure, you're dealing with really long-term paybacks, right? You're in a scenario where to deploy a fiber network to a home can cost thousands of dollars. But if you're in a scenario where you deploy a wireless antenna, wireless can create a similar amount of coverage for $10 per home, if not even less. It's just the power of wireless, right? And it's always kind of funny just to talk about it this way because you're taking these very concrete financial TMT terminology terms to explain unit economics and CapEx. But at the end of the day, it's like kind of obvious in the sense like if you're going to build a connectivity infrastructure, if you could beam it over the air the same way that Nikola Tesla and Marconi eventually envisioned, like why wouldn't you do it that way, right? So I think this is kind of just we're at a unique point in history where wireless is just good enough to do what we're doing. And now we're just kind of riding that wave and bringing it to market with the right orchestration layer that actually makes it scale effectively.
So let me kind of zoom out the camera lens to DePIN in general and maybe just explain it a little bit more for our audience, because I think people are actually still just learning about this category. It's sort of a niche category still within crypto, but I think it's the one that I personally believe is going to be the category that actually drives most of the market in the future, for maybe some other reasons we can discuss later in this. But so when we talk about DePIN, we're inherently talking about some kind of tokenized economy. And I'll ask you the question that I get asked constantly, which is, well, why do you need a token? Like, what's the whole purpose of this? And half the time there's a very cynical embedded question within that, which I'm not asking. So I'm just asking sort of like structurally, what do you think tokenization does that we wouldn't get out of, like, you could in theory, like, put these antennas all over the place and just have, I don't know, Amazon or Microsoft could just run the fee system for us and divide it all up, right?
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, what you said is a key point there is that a lot of what we see in DePIN, you technically could do this in a centralized fashion. There are a couple of major strengths that you get from the crypto perspective, and this is kind of something interesting that you said earlier, is all of these kind of DePIN CEOs that are colleagues of mine, they all come with deep technical experience that they don't think about decentralization first, they think about distributed systems first. And it's kind of distributed systems is what brings you towards decentralization. So really, it's the question of what's the difference between, I think at least between distributed systems and decentralization. Like that's, I guess, going a little bit more granular in this way. The first one is distributed systems versus decentralizations allow you to create staking models and staking systems that hold people accountable directly for the incentives that they provide. And I would also say allow you to have more dynamic markets that can form on both the marketplace of the actual resource, but then on a capital markets perspective as well. So that's like a lot of dense terminology for it. But the simple way that I always explain it is that we can form these networks without having to trust each other, because various different technologies like proofs allow us to validate the resource. So if I'm selling you my surplus internet, we have to answer that question is, how do you know that I have the internet to give you? And then once you're actually receiving that, how does the network actually know you're receiving what you were promised, right? The way that this is currently done today is you call Comcast and you complain and you say, hey, I'm seeing this speed. And they say, oh, no, I'm seeing that speed, right? It's this weird adjudication process. And so distributed systems, when they upgrade to decentralized systems, have recourse baked into the logic of the system. They have recourse baked in without a central party. That, I think, is kind of one of the most important aspects of any service provider related network, is that I have the ability to be held accountable for the services that I'm saying that I'm offering, and customers have an automatic way to get recourse without trust involved. And that is kind of the core of what I really identify for this, is you can build a network with people who don't trust each other. And there's a lot of cool stuff that gets to get layered on top of that. It's like capital markets, like the ability to fractionalize your infrastructure. There's a lot of really cool tools that you can start to put and build on top of that once you just take this typical challenge of how do you build a network with people that don't trust each other.
So that's a really interesting definition, because it may be a little different than I think about decentralization, actually. But let's play with that a little bit, because I think it's interesting to talk about this distinction between distributed systems and decentralized systems. So I think of and one of the things I always remind people, and maybe this is my own worldview coming forward, but decentralization, like blockchain, does not have a monopoly on the concept of decentralization either, even though it often gets used hand in hand. Like the internet itself is decentralized. The domain name system on the internet is decentralized. There's no CEO of internet. There's no CEO of DNS. There's no CEO of email. Like these are protocols that run in a highly decentralized way. You're introducing an interesting element, though, which is this whole trust mechanism, or the fact that we don't have to trust each other, but adding to it this idea of a recourse mechanism. Because when I think of like email, for example, I don't have any recourse when someone, spams my SMTP server. I just have to block them and have firewalls and stuff like that. So I would just love for the fun of this, and because I'm a nerd and I like definitions. What's the difference between how I'm thinking about decentralization, or am I just talking about a version of what you'd call a distributed system?
Yeah, I think you're talking about something that feels decentralized because to a large extent it is down to the individual market layer. But if you kind of go all the way to the end to like the actual exchange of the physical resources that power the network, that's when it becomes less of a decentralized system and more of a distributed system. So like a good example of this is, from the DNS side, like you can even talk from the DNS side or even the IP address side, like all of that stuff eventually rolls up to Aaron, right? And IANA that is doing these allocations of IP addresses to people, for example. So there is this kind of still one registry that delegates this out. So it does feel a little bit more like a decentralized system, but there's still ways in which everything downstream from that is kind of built off of implicit trust rather than codified explicit trust. And that's kind of what I see as a little bit of the difference, is that when you start about how do we share these resources in a way where we don't have to trust each other, everything else from downstream from that is baked into the trust. And so it's kind of the reverse of how the internet was built today, where a lot of the stuff is, if I need to form an internet connection with you at a data center, I'm just going to call you, John, and be like, hey, let's establish a BGP session together. What IP address are you going to use? What password do you want to use for this sort of stuff, right? This is kind of us creating trust on top of a structure that wasn't designed to solve trust or solve for trust. So at the end, and even if you take it on our simple example, like a good example from like the wireless side of stuff is that even Spectrum, right? Spectrum is another incredible example of a scarce resource that we all have to use, right? My router is using some frequency, your router is using other frequencies. And typically there is no coordination layer for that. And the coordination layer that we do care about is the one that is managed by governments, like the FCC, for example, right? So the FCC is an example of an entity that is kind of that provider of last trust. But when it comes time to actually build these networks without relying on these authorities, because you have any Joe Schmo can participate in the network, that's really when you need a fully trustless stack from the bottom to the top, because the stakes just get incredibly high now that anybody else can participate. So I would say, to answer the question, it's a little bit of both, right? It's really kind of a sliding scale of distributed systems towards decentralization and when can things break. And it's really just a question of what are all the downstream phenomena that can happen from that. And I'd say kind of one of the key downstream phenomena is this entire idea of fractionalizing infrastructure and then creating capital markets and programmable yield and all this other interesting stuff on top of that. That's just kind of like a byproduct of saying, how do I build my business with a publicly verifiable state machine? So it's really is quite an interesting conversation.
Okay, so we have the publicly verifiable state machine, as you put it, the blockchain, and I've got now a trustless ecosystem. It's the thing that really caught my attention around this early on when I first started looking deeply at blockchain, like I don't know, around the time Ethereum started being a thing, was just the idea of programmatic value exchange. To me, that was the really sort of industry world changing moment. The idea that two computers could talk to each other, sort of like what we've got with email. Like in my mind, it was like, okay, we can do email back and forth. We can do these various transactions. We can do a web server and a web client. There's no CEO of HTTP who gets to check if I'm allowed to access the web server first. The idea that then the value exchange could be embedded within those protocols, so that when a service has some cost associated with it, when there's an inherent CapEx or OpEx, and you want to be able to scale something up around something that has that cost structure, to me, the idea of that value exchange at the protocol level was really, really compelling to bring into this, what we have these slightly different definitions, but I may be being won over to your definition, FYI. But like these definitions of distributed decentralized systems, just the idea that you can create software primitives that communicate with each other on the internet and then shuttle value back and forth. To me, that was sort of like, okay, this is going to really change things. Now we're here like 10-ish years after, and it feels like it's starting to. It hasn't exactly like, it hasn't moved fast. Like this tech has been hard to get right. Some of it didn't really work that great, even up until a couple of years ago. So, okay, I want to return to the like why now kind of question as well. But before we get to the why now, first of all, it seems like value exchange is one of the consequences of having the trustless state machine. I want to kind of just bring it into, okay, back to the why token. Why do we need tokenization of these things again? You kind of gave the background of like what it accomplishes, this idea of having trustless systems. But what are the consequences of that? I think I've thrown out one, which I'm curious if you think it's as important as I do, but this idea of programmatic value exchange. But what are other consequences of having this kind of technology?
So, I mean, there's so much fun stuff to say based on what you said. I guess I'll preface this a little bit with like, I mean, you've been an engineer for a while, so you know what it's like to kind of build complicated backend systems and all this kind of stuff. But as we kind of like see everything from the growth of gig economy to even Uber, like my journey as an engineer has kind of made me feel like so much of the world is automatable. And to a large extent, it is automated, right? It's just automated in someone's back-end server, and it's obfuscated from you exactly how it works. But the underlying premise of even consider like a marketplace of buying, getting an Uber ride, for example, like a rideshare service, you can kind of envision all of the algorithms and the accounts. And from a first principles perspective, it's not hard to imagine how one would automate systems like this. The real thing that I kind of push back on constantly is like, I feel like the fact that it's just obfuscated from us from how it works and how value is extracted from that system is just an arbitrage that capital is able to take advantage of, right? When you're in a scenario where you can aggregate massive amounts of capital and obfuscate how the automation actually works, you're able to extract value in a way that there is no recourse for. And so the entire premise of all of this stuff is that anybody can take advantage of that arbitrage. And that arbitrage in the first case manifests as an information asymmetry, but now you're exposing it such that anybody can be a market participant. And I think that is kind of the big trend to answer to your question of like, what is it about decentralization that's so powerful? It's the fact that retail can participate. And that's the same thing that you say when you look at DeFi, right? Why like the kind of premise of DeFi is retail can participate. It's not just stuck behind big barrier to entries for capital expenditure and then yield and all of this kind of stuff. Anybody can participate in this entire ecosystem. And on the flip side, as we're seeing kind of now in DePIN, that's the major premise, is we're using advancements in technologies on distributed systems to pair them with decentralized systems to show that anybody can participate. And I think once the capital financing engine of participation, as well as the infrastructure engine of participates, that's when I think things really, the floodgates open, because you've kind of really fractionalized participation and exposed it to the retail audiences in a way that anybody can get involved. And we're already seeing trends of this happening. Like, I think that like the gig economy is like an excellent example of why we know decentralization is going to work in the future, because we already see this idea that I can fractionalize workloads and have everybody participate. Now we're just kind of moving up the stack in complexity. So it's kind of hard to answer this question because there's so many moving parts to it. But if you are in the perspective of like a Web 2 operator, like in my case, when you're building a telecom company, you know what it takes to be able to build your network. You know how you price your product. You know what it takes to raise capital to deploy your infrastructure. You know what are your obligations to your investors and to your users. The idea that all three of those things can be done in a public fashion where anybody can participate is really when things start to realize, I think, the ultimate vision of what automation is meant to achieve, right? Everything post-industrial revolution to where we are is just kind of an exercise in how do you automate the crap out of everything. And this is automating in a way that also maximizes exposure and participation to anybody. So it's a little bit of like, I just took a hit of something and a bit of a ramble, but in a very interesting way, I think it is kind of true.
Well, you're talking about more people being able to participate. And I think that really hits right into what one of our audience is saying. Thanks for the comment, Mandazino. I've seen you made a few other things, but Mandazino's talking about communities and the idea that decentralization encourages collaboration and shared ownership rather than top-down control. I think that also sort of parallels just the idea of ecosystem development. Like for me in our business at Beamable, one of the visions I had for this is there isn't a lot of like open source development in the back end universe for games. You have big pieces of tech, like you'll have like a database server or something like people will work on like a particular software suite. But in something that's a vertical industry like game development, for example, like things get created the 10,000th time over, the 100,000th time over, and there is a lack of standardization for how these backend components could plug into an ecosystem. There aren't many incentives currently to, even if you did have something that a lot of other people could use, there's really just not a lot of incentive to put it out there so that people can use it. If you want, sometimes people do it because they want to be nice, they want to get famous in GitHub, like, there's some of those kind of reasons, but other reasons such as I make a piece of software that everyone can use, but to really use it, it has to scale up and down infrastructure and be automated. Like there's your word right there, automated. Like if you want to automate the inclusion of these software elements, there's no easy way to do it because all these things are within centralized, in our case, like the competition of DePIN, so to speak, ends up being like the hyperscalers. So AWS and Azure and GCP. And while there are striking similarities in the way they work, there's also differences. And like, you don't just sort of pull code off one and put it on another and it just works. It doesn't drop into your other software. And then on top of that, you have the whole standards issue, which is data languages, programming languages, interface specifications just vary every single time because there's never been that reason to contribute to a backend infrastructure. So one of the real hopes we have, and it's only really started to happen for us, like we have a bunch of partners who are building on our platform, but our goal is when we open up the ecosystem through DePIN and you get to the point of like infrastructure, we've talked about this term infrastructure as code, and infrastructure as code exists, but not really portably, not in a way that does what we were just talking about, where the value exchange could just be peer-to-peer with anybody on the internet who wants to offer those services to help support scale up and scale down of applications. And that kind of changes everything. It lets everybody just kind of make software modules that have inherent property of supporting scale, which is the unique trait of server-based software, right? So client-side software, you can ship one copy to everybody, and as long as it runs on their CPU, it's fine. Server software doesn't work like that. Like you got real scale issues on the back end, which everybody more or less is left to figure out themselves. So I really thought that DePIN was the unlock for creating real software ecosystems on top of the kind of the equipment layer. So long explanation there of, I think, one of the other benefits of decentralization that I saw that Mandazino is kind of pointing that with his comment. But do you also see things like that? Like you kind of talked about like the sort of the immediate end user benefit, but what's the end game in the kind of broadband networks that you talk about? And does that lead to like ecosystem as well?
Yeah, so solid. And to get to actually what Mandazino is saying here. So I think if we were hanging out and having a beer and I'm ranting about the stuff that bothers me in the world, I'm going to say the same stuff that Mandazino says. But as I've kind of learned as a CEO over the past several years, I really focus on to the stuff that you talk about is in terms of value transfer, is because even though that is kind of at the heart of why I do what I do, exactly what Mandazino is saying, the way that I kind of have to explain it and plan for it, it really comes down to how does value transfer work today and how do I want value transfer to work tomorrow? And how does value transfer work in a scenario where it's powered by, to what Mandazino is saying, by communities? And so the biggest kind of argument that, or the biggest, easiest way to explain it is imagine all of the value that is being created to people that are building data centers as a result of AI, right? You have folks like Digital Realty, CoreWeave,
Equinix, so many types of companies that are, Oracle, right? There's so many people that are building this massive infrastructure to meet this demand about where the world is going. It's going to be trillions of dollars of asset value that is created and owned by a few people at the infrastructure level. All that I'm saying is that the process of allowing anybody to participate, the process of allowing people to see where arbitrage opportunities are, the people allowing people to get the capital they need to be able to deploy this infrastructure is how you make sure that trillions of dollars doesn't get allocated by the market into people that actually have the upstart capital to do that. You allow anybody to do that, to get access to that. And so I very much so see everything that falls downstream from AI, telecom, all of this kind of stuff, because of DePIN, distributed infrastructure, because of these capital markets, we're faced with an opportunity where that trillions of dollars of wealth can be located in the homes of individual people. That is kind of the arc of this journey that I'd like to think that I'm hopefully helping a little bit on, is I just want all of that value, instead of ending up in Larry Ellison's pocket, I want that to be in the pockets of all of the average people, right? And I think it's just what we're seeing is capital concentration is just remarkably good at creating asset value. But distributed technology and decentralized technology presents an opportunity to move things in the direction, right? What is it like if capital scale is not a unique factor to how you can grow infrastructure, right? What if I can create the same unit of value as a small guy versus a big guy? That, I think, is the ultimate nature of how the stuff manifests in a financial perspective. So that's kind of like one little bit of ramble that I have on that side of how I think about like ownership and really where the real value comes from, how ownership gets changed. To get to your point about like protocols, I was actually drafting a tweet on this earlier today. I think the unique power of protocols is that they kind of create this gravity well of participation, both on the market side and the technology side. Is that you kind of have this interop layer that exists that just improves the experience of folks that are participating in the capital market side and folks that are participating on the infrastructure side. And the easiest example and kind of the basis of my tweet was actually this, right? And I don't know if you use AirPods or anything like that, but I have AirPods and I have an iPhone. If you've ever used your AirPods with an iPhone, you'll see that the ability to connect to your phone with your headphones is just a 10x better user experience. I don't have to go into my Bluetooth settings to go through these different devices. If I'm on my laptop, it seamlessly switches because it knows, right? That's what happens when you build a protocol. And that's a protocol that is not open to everybody. If I'm not using an Apple device, I still have to do stuff the janky way, right? I still have to go into my Bluetooth settings and switch between them. And it's just the power of protocols. Protocols just bring better user experiences. They bring better network effects from devices, and they allow you to exchange value in a much more efficient way. And I think all of that is just, it's interesting to see excellent examples from a Web 2 perspective of how protocols have changed our lives, right? Like, Bluetooth and AirPods is one small example, but the most powerful example that I think of is something like TCP/IP, right? Is the entire network backbone is built off of a quote unquote protocol that allows everybody to fall in and participate under a single interoperability layer. If I want to send data to you, John, and I say, hey, I don't want to use TCP/IP, you're going to tell me, okay, go away. I don't like, why am I going to waste my time doing this sort of stuff? I think that's the power of what protocols can actually achieve. They can really build, like, to what you're saying, this interoperability layer where anybody can participate under a set of standards. And I think, as you gave me a great idea, and this is not committing to all of this, but as we kind of think about building towards our protocols, I think how cool would it be to give some level of network ownership to people that issue pull requests that end up getting accepted into your underlying protocol. There's a lot of cool stuff you can think for that sort of stuff. But just a little food for thought there. But hopefully that makes sense in terms of like the value of ownership being shared across many people and where asset value accrues, combined with like the power, I think, of what an interop layer can really achieve.
So you said capital a few times in there, and capital markets. I think I said internet capital markets early on. And I mean, one of the things that also attracted me to DePIN in the case of compute was the opportunity to actually create a new asset class too. Like energy is a type of asset. Compute isn't really. Like today, compute is servers you rent from Amazon or Azure or GCP, and you pay them whatever they want to, but it's not like fungible. It's not liquid. You can't trade it. You definitely don't divide it down into smaller quanta of work and get just the piece you need on demand streamed to your app as you need it which is precisely what energy does. Like energy actually works that way, but compute doesn't. And I thought that would be very transformative as well. I'll hold off on giving more reasons of why it's transformative. But Neil, you've said capital a few times. Whether or not you want to run with my particular example there, like how are you thinking about capital structure on what you're doing? Are you creating a new asset class, and what does that do for everybody?
Yeah, so I would actually disagree with what you said on the compute side of stuff.
Hmm.
And the reason why I would disagree is because I think right now you're correct. It's not this kind of resource that's easy to subdivide and allocate, but we have seen things like that kind of go in that direction. Like AWS Lambda is a good example, right? You have serverless workloads
Sure.
nowadays. So I think that's gonna eventually be an element of the future, but I think there's a lot of deep technical stuff down on the operating system level that people haven't figured out how to network these resources together to actually make them subdividable.
Mhm.
So that's just the reason I only push back on this, because what you said on the compute side is one that I think about a lot, because I think it's eventually got to happen. It's eventually got to be this properly subdividable asset. But to get onto the capital market side of stuff, I think the biggest answer that I can give to that and what we're building is we're building something that allows people to be able to get access to the capital that they need to be able to build out networks. And whether that is through the value of what a token ends up being worth at some point, or whether that's through some other bespoke products or financial products that actually give people the liquidity they need to be able to go build out net new infrastructure. I think every DePIN project actually, it's incumbent on them to build these sorts of financial solutions in their system, because that's just kind of how you scale, and how you allow your other users to scale too, right? In the kind of the first wave of DePIN during the 2020 and 2021 days of Helium, all of the network build out was financed by people directly off of their balance sheet, right? They're essentially individual households, buildings, whatever, are buying Helium nodes. They're throwing them up there and having to get a return for their time and all that kind of stuff. But when we think about more mature capital markets, not everything is financed that way, right? The credit market is an example of one of the biggest markets that's out there, right? And so I think what's interesting and what we're seeing through this latest generation of tech of capital markets and capital as a solution for growing networks is we're seeing this new category come out of uncorrelated yield. And what I mean by that is that all of DeFi, in terms of building leverage-based systems, borrow-lend protocols, collateralized debt pools, all of this kind of stuff, in DeFi, it's all correlated to the market, right? And people are trying nowadays to build solutions that are uncorrelated to the market. And what I mean by that is, can I participate in a borrow-lend protocol where my yield isn't tied to what Bitcoin is doing? Right, that's the end objective, and the reason why it's the end objective is because that's how the modern internet, or the modern economy is built. Right, when I'm making an investment into a solar panel based distribution system, I don't expect the price of the SPY to have an impact on my returns, right? I'm expecting there to be a reliable return based on the actual demand and the actual usage. And I think this is the entire category. I think is quite interesting. People are calling it nowadays InfraFi. I think that's kind of one of the final categories that we need to see for DePIN and DeFi to be properly married together, so that anybody can participate and get access to that non-correlated yield. That I think is kind of one of the bigger final frontiers that we have to see in crypto and DePIN and DeFi as well. And plenty to say about what we're doing on that side, but I'll save it for the Git book or all that kind of stuff that'll come out soon.
Yeah, so I should clarify what I was saying earlier about the subdivisibility of compute, and because what I was trying to do is relate it more to a capital market or an asset class structure in this. So Neil earlier was describing lambdas. So for those who are not software engineers working on distributed system, a lambda is basically, think of it as a function that runs in the cloud that can be replicated as many times as you're willing to pay for, and it'll just sort of spam that one function across a whole bunch of servers. And if you work with Amazon, for example, as well as any of the other major hyperscalers, they have lots of things that can kind of automatically scale up, scale down, provision machines, and run that function everywhere you want. So if your function has to run a lot of times and deal with spikes, and you don't want to just have machines sitting there, there's a solution for that. What isn't there is doing that in a more decentralized way, which I think is what lends it to making this into a true internet capital market. Because once we can take those lambdas, or in the case of Beamable, we use a architecture called microservices for kind of doing something relatively similar, where you're breaking down the compute elements of a program, in this case, in our case, specialized around the software you have to run for game servers, essentially, like all the stuff you do in the cloud to scale up for millions of users. Break it down into these tiny units of work, as tiny as you can get them. And then you provision servers automatically and release servers according to whatever the actual real world demand is for that. So you can do that with Amazon today. It's not really an asset class. It's more of like a contractual relationship where they'll promise to get you those servers when you need them. Although Monday of this week, there were some issues with that we all heard about. But in general, actually, they're really good at this. But what's lacking from it, and what turns it into a internet capital market, as I think of it, is now taking that fungible compute. And first of all, anybody can contribute the compute. You want an internet in which I've got an internet of that compute supply, and I can say, hey, I've got a computer that can satisfy that demand. Here it is, and anybody have at it. This is what I want to charge. So now my price is in an order book, and because everybody else is adding compute, and there's a whole bunch of buyers, now I've got an order book that's matching supply to and demand to pricing. Now I've got market forces that are converging the price towards what ought to be fair based on a market economy versus monopoly economy. So to me, that's what's super cool about that.
It's just such the way. Honestly, when you describe that, it's kind of nerdy for me to say, but it's beautiful, right? It's beautiful in terms of if we could achieve something like that. There's a level of elegance to that is kind of, I think, the culmination of what you learn in an academic mindset about computing and scale and all of this kind of stuff. And I think it's the part that I've been a little bit saddened by is all of the projects that were working on something like this stopped working on this once AI boom happened, right? They pivoted from kind of creating these decentralized compute units, and then now they're just focusing on like inference aggregation and all of that kind of stuff. And what's funny about it too is that we do in the case of a server, which is kind of just one high performance state machine, versus the blockchain, which is another lower performance state machine. Like in Solana, we do have compute units, right? So this idea is actually embedded in these decentralized protocols. I'm so excited if we ever get to that point where that same idea can exist across server workloads, and then you can actually have an order book on this sort of stuff. Like it really is kind of quite an elegant idea, and I think like more would be quite happy to see something like that, or at least I hope.
Yeah, I see it as like stream the compute you need to the application, and that's where I draw the comparison to energy. Like you utilize the amount of energy you basically have an energy market, although energy is not as decentralized for sure, like as what compute could be, because you tend to deal with like specific points that you're able to access the energy grid, or you're installing a solar panel or something like that. So it's more decentralized on the selling side of solar, of like energy, right? Like if I want to give it back, that's more decentralized. It's not too decentralized to receive energy, because I have to literally install my own energy producing equipment or plug into whoever typically there's only one monopoly provider in any given area. But the cool thing with compute is like it could be compute anywhere. And I just envision there being ultimately a spot market for compute, right? So basically say, I need this much compute, or you don't even have to, it's just done programmatically. Like I'm willing to pay this much for compute to support my application. Just go provision it at this price, and we'll take care of everybody based on their actual needs. And then on top of that, well, how do you deal with things like fluctuations and what the markets will do? Well, then you have a futures market for hedging the price of compute and things like that. So a lot of financialized systems, and this kind of comes back to what you were talking about in kind of DeFi meets infrastructure, InfraFi, the ability to actually think of these things as asset classes and payments for units of work. I think that's going to be transformative. And you mentioned AI. Like, I think that becomes really interesting too, because we all have these reasonably powerful inference engines just sitting on our phones, frankly, even at this point, which can do a lot of inference. Now, training is a whole other problem where you have to do these, massive, colossus data centers like Elon's building in Texas. But like on the inference side, there's almost no reason why the vast majority of inference problems couldn't be done on a much more decentralized basis. And that's a great example of like where AI should meet blockchain, and there should be an AI. I mean, I think that's what a lot of AI companies are thinking of these days.
Yeah, like one of my favorite companies in the space, probably I shouldn't say one of my actual favorite company in the space is Sam Hogan's Inference.net, formerly known as Kuzco. The reason why I love what they're doing is because they're tackling this exact problem, but they're approaching it from the perspective of what unique value does a distributed system offer that a non-distributed system does not offer. And the way that they're realizing that is by training specific models that actually do work on distributed systems versus centralized systems. So I'd say I totally agree. I think that's exactly the direction that this stuff is going in. And it's just cool to see how these DePIN founders are finding the technical opportunity that is created through distributed technology, rather than just saying, hey, I want to create a decentralized system. No. These guys are approaching it from the problem of like, let's build a distributed system that is better than the alternatives out there. And then let's find a way to glue that all together. And a blockchain is just the perfect solution to all of that. So a little bit of an aside on the AI piece, and we can always talk more about AI. We can talk about AI indefinitely.
So Neil, let's dial it in actually to maybe DePIN specifically and what goes into making a successful DePIN startup. And I'll say successful in that, like, revenue in DePIN is still super low. Like, this is the earliest of categories. There's nothing that's like at what you even consider scale for like a scaled SaaS company, nothing even close to that. So we're still quite early in adopting this business model. That said, there's probably some early patterns and things that separate DePIN projects that look like they may succeed versus the others. Like, as a DePIN founder, like, how do you prioritize what's important? Like, or for people who are just trying to even evaluate projects, what would you, looking at someone else, what would you look at? Like, what's important?
So, I mean, the answer that I want to give is not the answer that I like, unfortunately. But I think it's kind of a reality of these things. Is a lot of projects, because people hit me up all the time. They're like saying, like, what do you think about this project? How do I get it off the ground? And the overall, advice that I always give people is that you have to understand that, capital raising is kind of like a core piece for every venture-backed company. And the only way that you can really, I think, do an effective job of capital raising is if you understand the business model of venture capital. And I think the business model of venture capital is a little bit of a weird one in the sense that people are looking for fund returners, right? I want to make 20 investments, 19 of them can fail, but one of them is going to return the fund. And when that is how venture capital works, that means that you have to make sure that in order to be a good match for an investment from a venture capital fund, you need to have a fund returner, right? You need to have a vision, a business, a plan, a protocol that is commensurate with the scale that is required to return a fund. And that means you have to work on a big problem. And so I think that the key towards all of this is if you are a founder, you have to make sure that you are working on a big freaking problem. And I think the only way that people can work on big freaking problems is by being nuanced enough about their field to understand how they can use abstraction to build up the primitives to actually solve a very big problem. There's a lot of different kind of points into that, but the reason why I think, like in our case, like why Dawn is so transformative for what it's doing and why kind of the community has seen this and investors and all that sort of stuff is because I have built networks with my own two hands for now, approaching over a decade, right? So I think I've been in this scenario where I can see what things are actually looking like. I know enough stuff from the engineering side of stuff to understand where are the points of abstraction, where is the market going, where are the opportunities of efficient and by all of these things.
And so the question I think that I come to when I look at this sort of stuff is you need to be a founder that can really understand how to abstract your space to see where the space is going. So you can pitch a vision that makes sense, that is actually this 100x opportunity for everybody that is involved. So that's why I hate this answer, but I think it's kind of the reality of the case, where you need to build a damn big problem, and the systematic approach to how you build a big problem ultimately comes down to immersing yourself in that industry for long enough. And I've seen a lot of founders that are out there that they can raise money, but they're never as successful at it because they don't have as much experience in the space. Like every single founder that I can talk to, like Sam is like another excellent example. Like this guy is like, if I have an AI question, he's the guy that I'd ask to, right? Dave Rodas on Pipe is another good example of like a CEO that just gets the space. He gets this idea of CDN stuff. And the same thing goes for Omar from Blockcast, right? These are all guys that we partnered with because these are founders that understand their space deeply enough. They can build abstractions on top of their understandings that help them see where the market is going to create value for participants at an order of magnitude of a scale, right? Like that's again, I hate that answer because it's not the fun answer, but it is the answer, I think, of how markets, at least, private markets work in a lot of ways.
So it sounds like the qualitative answer is founders who have deep domain expertise coupled with a big vision, quantitatively speaking, meaning that they have a reason at 100x returns. But I think there's kind of two pieces to that, right? Like market size question, like could it be 100x return? And then there's but are you actually able to go from point A to point B, which kind of from the expertise side of things, and probably something that's generally lacking in crypto founders. Honestly, although many of them are at marketing, like that's a skill too, and I'm going to take it away from that. But the fundamental skills have been kind of lacking. That is the cool thing about DePIN. Like so many founders that I meet have that expertise, and they like really understand a problem domain and what hasn't worked or how you can benefit from distributing or decentralizing the technology. What about the earliest stages though? Like what are the KPIs, to throw out that lame business word? Like what are the metrics, the numbers that actually matter in a early DePIN project? Because we're all kind of early. Like what's important to you?
So there's like the actual metrics that I would use to evaluate the state of the protocol. Like a good example, like in our case, in the case of Dawn, there's really only two KPIs we care about. Like everything that we do at the organization is built to further these KPIs. Number one is on-chain revenue. That's an obvious one, which is our kind of demand metric. The other one is our quote unquote supply metric, right? In our case, how many households are eligible for this type of wireless service? And so I work backwards from what those KPIs I want them to be over the next 5 years. And that's how kind of my capital allocation plan follows from that. So the answer is like from a protocol, you're kind of building a marketplace for a protocol, right? So they're going to have a demand side on a marketplace and a supply side. So I think try to distill it down to the demand and supply side KPIs and which ones matter. That's on that side. The other most important thing is, again, on the quantitative side, is unit economics. I think all of the founders that I think understand the space really well, they have a deep understanding of how the unit economics of the business, of rather not even the business, of how the unit economics of the sector work today. And then their understanding of the space allow them to see how the unit economics of the sector can work tomorrow and on. And I think the reason why I focus on unit economics is as a key piece is because every DePIN project, whether you're focusing on energy, bandwidth, compute, storage, whatever, all we're doing is trying to turn these resources into a commodity. Something as simple as a spigot of water you can turn, and to your point on the compute resources, out it flows. In order to be able to do that, you need to understand how cost evolves over time, how you can improve unit economics, but then preferably, as we start thinking about like on the upside, is how can your unique implementation of decentralization improve experiences and be a 10x better solution? And so in our case, the argument towards that is I make the argument where not even a 5-year time span. Once we start launching a bunch of our software components, the idea is if you are somebody that's deploying wireless infrastructure, whether you're somebody that is deploying a mesh node in your home to expand coverage, or maybe you're a large telecom operator deploying a point to multi-point antenna, the idea is why would you deploy anywhere else other than Dawn, right? That's what I'm trying to build, is this kind of gravity well, and to your point on the interop side, where it only makes sense to be able to deploy here. So the early KPIs is like deep understanding of unit economics, being able to verify that your vision for unit economics is going to further turn this resource into a commodity. And number 3, I guess, is demonstrating that the user experience is going to be much, much better for everybody involved into that. And so I think the most important thing is finding whatever way you can to be able to demonstrate those things for anybody that looks.
One of the things that I liked that you just described was kind of breaking down this idea of DePIN is almost always kind of a two-sided marketplace, right? So there's a demand side, there's a supply side. There's people that are adding to the network. There's people that are the customers of the network and are there to use it for whatever its stated purpose is. And historically on the internet, two-sided marketplaces have been really hard businesses to boot up, actually. Like, it's really hard to like get both of those sides growing at the right rate. How do you think about that?
So it's a good question. And the reason why I think this is very vertical dependent is because it comes down to the cold start problem. Is what level of critical mass do you need in your supply before people on the demand side can realize value for that, right? Like a good example is like Airbnb, right? Like if Airbnb is not everywhere, like I'm not even gonna go to the platform in the first place to be able to search that up. And so I think that what we're seeing with kind of this next generation of DePIN protocols is folks that don't need a massive amount of supply to be able to achieve that, to address exactly that problem that you're facing, right? And so I think that's why, like, kind of to use Dawn as like another good example, all I need is one person with surplus bandwidth and they can provide value to somebody else in the surrounding area. Like that, I think, is kind of the power of what the right chosen infrastructure can do. Is you don't need to inflate your token to a maximum amount to be able to create that supply. You can still create value for the users in the network without having some level of massive scale. And so these things from a both supply and demand side will kind of follow a little bit more closely to each other. I think it's the real question, though, is how do you escape from that? How do you kind of get escape velocity on that? And that's where I think the interop layer and the technology layer comes in, where you're not even solving a crypto problem or a distribution problem, you're solving a technology problem. How do I build a technology that wants to get everybody involved in that? And like another, like a simple example towards this is like pump fund, right? Like the ability to create meme coin at the snap of a fingers is just valuable technology to the market. You know, it's something that has given them escape velocity, but it's purely a technology thing. And so I think that is kind of how I view the life cycle of like these maturing DePIN projects, is ones that understand how to drive demand into their system without having like 100% supply. And then on top of that, building technology that will soak up Web 2 audiences or Web 3 audiences in massive scale. And that is when you kind of get this escape velocity flywheel going. So that's kind of the way that I currently think about it. I think that thought process of like the life cycle of DePINs and how they evolve is going to continue to evolve over time. I definitely don't have the perfect answer today.
So don't build out massive amounts of supply before you even know what your demand looks like. That's something that I think we've seen too many times at this point. And then
Agreed.
Then you're just doing endless token emissions, and it's not good for the token economy when that happens. And then it's hard to attract more supply when everybody has left, because now the token is doing bad things. So demand. I mean, we have always prioritized demand in our business because we felt the supply side of our problem is, it's also hard to solve, but it's a way easier to solve than demand. When I spoke to Amir from Helium a few weeks back on this stream, I asked him what was hard about what they were doing, and he was like, it's kind of the stuff that most crypto founders think is boring, like conversion funnels and customer acquisition costs and like signing people up to use the service, not for the token, for the service that we offer. And that's like typical like SaaS business, like, business building 101, and is the exact thing that's seems like it's not exactly second nature for the majority of founders in our category.
Yeah, and the part that I'll add to that is like that I think is what Amir is describing, and that mindset is what reproducible success looks like. There's a reason why, from a SaaS perspective, it's become so engineered in terms of like a business operations perspective, is because that's the only way that you can reproduce success. And so I guess like one other advice that I'd give to founders or hopeful founders, anybody, is try to understand what reproducible success looks like. And what Amir is describing is the perfect example of that. You know, it's very unlikely that you're going to make this like off the ground protocol that happens to like blow up and now every single developer and engineer wants to work with that. You could definitely aspire to that, but you got to focus, to the earlier point about what people have to focus on, is reproducible success day one.
Mm-hmm. Neil, I'm looking at the clock and we're coming right up to the hour that we set out. I feel like we could go multiple hours and you could just give a masterclass on not only DePIN, but doing a startup. So I appreciate your time. I want to give you, though, a moment here to just talk about your project, your company a little bit more. Like, what should people know right now and what's next?
Yeah, thanks for that, man. And this has been a blast, right? Like I would love to be on another one of these one day. But to kind of wrap up from our side, I appreciate everybody who's listened. Like I've said a lot of stuff that might or might not be BS. I got no idea. But what I do know that is what we're building from a wireless side of stuff is the future. And it's only a matter of time until we as a society move from a wired world to a wireless one. Mm-hmm. So all I'd say is that if this idea of being able to kind of Airbnb out your internet is intriguing to you, if the idea of making sure that communications as we go into the future is owned by people, additionally, if you believe that digital infrastructure, the internet as we know it, should be owned by the people and the immense value you can make for you and your neighbors, if that's of interest to you, just follow what we're doing. We got a lot of cool stuff coming up, whether it's in terms of our black box, which is our vision of a router that can participate in many DePIN projects, whether that's our individual nodes that allow you to buy and sell internet between you and your neighbors. We got a bunch of cool stuff coming out. And if you're ever curious about this and want to have some fun conversations on Twitter, just hit me up.
That is super cool, Neil. And for closing here, I'll say we're doing a lot of stuff ourselves at Beamable here. We're building an internet capital market for compute, basically. And our foothold is the game industry, which has about the weirdest, spikiest demand profiles you can imagine. So it really needs this almost more than any industry. Games can go from down here to suddenly you need 1 million users. And that's a super cool thing, a super cool problem to work on, and figuring out how to make the economics of that something accessible to everybody who wants to make a game, because it's the media category of our time, but ultimately has a lot of application to the rest of the world. And our next step is we are doing our TGE. So you can learn about that on my X feed. I'm not going to say too much more about it here because you can just read it. Just go to me, Jon Radoff, or go to Beamable Network. It's in both places. You can read all about it. And if what I'm working on sounds cool, would certainly invite you to take a look and learn more about the project and what we're doing. Neil, this has been a blast. Really fun conversation. Appreciate it. I'm sure we're going to run into each other again online for sure, at conferences for sure. Thanks for joining me today and being part of this.
Thank you so much for the time, man. I really appreciate the fun conversation. And I'll come up to Boston one of these days and we'll hang out.
Let's do it. All right.